In this video, you will learn how to graph systems of linear inequalities. So when you see the word system, what that means is that we have more than one of something. So a system of linear inequalities means we have more than one inequality. So for example, here we see y is less than or equal to x plus 2. That is my first inequality. My second inequality is 1 minus y is less than or equal to 0. So we have two inequalities, and we are to graph this system on this coordinate plane. So to begin, I take each inequality and graph each one separately. So y is less than or equal to x plus 2. This one is already in graphing form, right? It's in slope-intercept form. The second one, let's rearrange this to put into graphing form as well, into slope-intercept form. So to do that, for the second one, there's different ways you can rearrange, but you want y by itself, so I can subtract 1. That gives me negative y. It's less than or equal to negative 1. And then get rid of this 1 in front, the negative 1, by dividing both sides by negative 1. When I do that, I now have a y on the left side, and then on the right side we have a positive 1. And because we divided by a negative, we must switch the inequality from a less than to a greater than. So the second inequality can be written as y is greater than or equal to 1. So looking at the first inequality right here, the slope is 1. So the slope is 1 and the y-intercept is 2. So I can graph very quickly. The intercept is 2, so I go up 2. And the slope is 1, or 1 over 1. Remember, we have rise over run. So the rise is 1. So from this point, I go up 1, and then I go to the right 1 because the run is also 1. I connect the dots with a solid line, and I get this line right here. So this is a solid line because this inequality sign has an equal to with it. So if it's just a less than, it'd be a dotted line, but this equal sign with it makes it a solid line. And then for this one, the graphing, we see y is less than. So the shading would be below this line because y is less than this line. So y is smaller when it's below. All right, so I shade in everything below, and then I do the same thing with the second inequality. We have y is greater than or equal to 1, and if it's helpful, you can think of this as 0x plus 1, where the slope is 0 and the y-intercept is 1. So if the y-intercept is 1, it's going to go right up here through 1, and it's going to be a horizontal line because the slope is 0. So my line would be this horizontal line right here at 1. Now for this inequality, it is a solid line because we have the equal to as part of the inequality. And our shading is going to be above because it says y is greater than or equal to. Because y is greater than 1, that means you're going to be shading in above 1. That's going to be everything up here. So my final answer, my final shading for this graph is where these two overlap. So notice the shading overlaps right here in this little area. So my final answer, I would shade in that area, and I can erase everything else. So this right here would be my final graph of this system. So again, we graph each inequality separately and then see where the graphs overlap. Wherever the shading of the graphs overlap, that is my final answer, and make sure we have the lines correct as well. Let's try one more example. Here we have y plus x is less than 2, and then y minus x is less than or equal to 2. So we want to rearrange each of these inequalities to put into slope-intercept form so I can graph quickly. So the first one, we can solve for y by subtracting x. We now have y is less than negative x plus 2. So that is my first inequality after we rearrange it. And then the second one, we have y minus x is less than or equal to 2. So to solve this one for y, we can add x to both sides. We now have y is less than or equal to, and then x plus 2. So here are our two inequalities, and from here we can graph. So this first inequality right here, our slope is going to be a -1, and then our y-intercept is a +2. The second inequality, our slope is a +1, and then our y-intercept would be a +2 as well. So graphing the first inequality, the y-intercept is 2, which would be up 2 on the y-axis. The slope is -1, or -1 over 1. Remember, this is rise over run. So that means I go down 1 and to the right 1 to get this point right here. So I can connect the dots with a dotted line, and it's dotted because the inequality sign is a less than and does not have an equal to as part of it. So it's a dotted line, and then the shading would be below because it says y is less than. So y is smaller when it's below. So I shade in everything below. And then I do the same thing for the second inequality. So I graph the second one. Here our y-intercept is 2 again. It's going to be this point on the y-axis. And the slope is 1, or 1 over 1. And remember, that's rise over run. So from this point I go up 1 and over 1. And then I connect the dots with a solid line. And it's a solid line because we have the equal to sign as part of the inequality. And then the shading for this one would be below. It's below that line because it is less than. So y is less than means y is smaller than this line, and y is smaller when it's below. So I graph below that line, and I get everything here we see in black. So my final answer, my final graph, is where they overlap. So notice they overlap right in here, in this area. So my final answer is going to have just this part shaded in. So everything else we can erase. So we keep the lines, and then our shading is right down here in the bottom part of the graph.